Alright, shitlords, we're here to get woke and get educated today. I'm hoping to make it a goal to get out more videos about current events in Canada, because shit is crazy up here. And like some of my other videos go into, Canada is going to be the first nation to fall in Europe or anywhere else. Well, any country but South Africa anyway.
The thing that saddens me the most about, this year is that I think queer bodies are missing. Trans bodies are missing. Black women are missing.
My pain is about my race, it's about my gender, it's about my sexuality, it's about my class issue. It's like a whole lot of things.
We have fought for so long about positionality, intersectionality, feminism within our spaces. And it almost seems as if that politics has been erased.
You have to also find strength to fight against white supremacy, fight against homophobia, fight against gender-based violence, fight against rape culture. And when am I going to finish? I need to start living my life as well,
There are lessons to learn. There definitely are. The way in which people were way better organized and mobilized under apartheid with, civic associations, street committees, and involving the communities. Our struggle is their struggle is our struggle. We come from these communities.
I wouldn't even have the time to read off all the headlines that roll through our daily news that document the daily degeneration of the country, and that's just what makes it to the actual news. So for this video, I'm not going to be putting up much in the way of visuals, so I suggest you just listen to it in the background. Other than one small section, I'll let you know when that is. Either way, I'll be reading off enough of it to make the point. So on that note, let's look at this article by the Halifax Examiner. A White People's Guide to Black History Month. It's February, the most dangerous month of the year for free speech and free expression in Canada. That does give me an idea. I wonder what I would find if I were to look at the charge dates of hate crimes. I don't think I can find that data readily available, but that would be interesting. A good way to start off the month, if you're white, is by a bunch of white people having a conversation among themselves about how important it is to have a conversation about whether blackface is racist or not, but also that you didn't say the things that you are directly quoted as saying. You know how black people can't read. Yeah, we're going there. Clearly, what is most racist in Black History Month is that it should be called All Histories Month. Are you saying only black histories matter? Why do you hate other histories? Even though black people misleadingly claim this month is only about history, in reality, you will find that black people like to use this month to talk about racism, even though history is over and racism only existed back then. What is key in conversations about racism is not to speak to any black people. You see, how passive-aggressive is this shit, eh? You see, when black people talk about how things are racist by giving things like facts, history, or explaining their lives' experience, it's very important to remember that your opinion that you just came up with yesterday to defend something that black people explain is racist is obviously more valid. And I've got to wonder, is a conclusion that I came to yesterday somehow less valid than a conclusion I came to years ago? Seems to me that more recently you've come to an opinion, more likely it is to be valid. I mean, people do need to update their opinions, and that's usually a good thing. And so this first bit's obviously referring to the fetus farmer, Ralph Northman. When he came up with these costumes, I bet he never thought that decades later people would forget what irony was. Nobody ever predicted that you wouldn't be able to tell sarcasm on the internet. Here are some good words to remember for Black History Month. Always describe issues of racism as controversial. That makes it sound like there's a debate about these issues. Then, you get to position yourself as calm and reasonable, and the people who are talking about things like history and systemic racism as disruptive, dangerous, and irrational. Always suggest that all you are doing is debating. Just remember, black people aren't actual humans who have lives, jobs, or dignity. Black people just exist as examples for you to use to illustrate controversial issues, kind of like specimens or zoo animals. Yeah, or just statistics on paper like I look at them, right? I mean, what a brittle straw man, holy fuck. Like, that argument just goes nowhere. Black people just exist as examples for you to use to illustrate controversial issues? What, regarding black people? If black people object to your characterization of them, then to be sure to say you were just joking, just raising some interesting points for discussion, or that you are just exploring both sides in a balanced manner. If black people are hurt by having white issues that seriously affect their lives callously made into examples, then move to the next step. Always accuse black people of being offended. Remember, they are emotional and unstable, and you are a calm, reasonable white person. Calling them sensitive or PC is another good option. No matter how informed they are, always suggest the problem is their perceptions and feelings. Black people can get carried away easily. That's why there's so many of them in prison. Remember, when you are being emotional, this is what we get these days. The things like seeing grade high school appeal to emotion, having conversations that don't involve you.
Alright, pause. I don't know what the fuck is happening here with the sound overlap. Some sort of editing error, I think. Hopefully it's done with. But going back and trying to redub it will probably just make this shitty audio even worse.
Refer to this as common sense. When you say offensive things, suggest that you are open to debate. This makes it sound like black people are aggressive and angry, and you are being victimized by them, yet still maintaining the high ground. However, if you have already been debated and lost, then you should say that you didn't actually say the things that you said, and suggest that you don't know why black people are acting like this. I'm sure that's a conversation that happens, and I'm also sure it's only black people that happens too. Don't forget, you are civil. Just like I'm sure we'll get to this soon enough. I mean, being questioned for shoplifting? Oh, come on, man. If you're being a young man, I'm sure women too, they shoplift more. I know that because my cousins have been caught. Every female cousin I had has been caught shoplifting when they were 12 or whatever. And that wasn't racial profiling because they were white as can be. Suggest that you don't know why black people are acting like this. Don't forget, you are civilized and they, well, don't worry about ignoring previous times black people have already spoken to you and explained. Nobody actually cares what black people think and say, so you can pretend they never said it with no consequences. This is the world this author lives in, apparently, and so many thousands of other people live in a world where this is their reality. This is what they wake up into and live and breathe every morning. We got a little Roseanne Barr tweet in there. She should have never apologized. If you make it through these basic levels, there are some other ways you can celebrate Black History Month. For example, it's always a good idea to throw in a quote by Martin Luther King. Don't bother reading Letters from Birmingham Jail or Beyond Vietnam. Don't even bother reading the entirety of the I Have a Dream speech. We all know white people can't read. Just read the line about holding hands with white little girls and boys. White people are the most important part of what Martin Luther King Jr. stood for and should be centralized in your discussion of him. He had a dream that only white people would be judged for the color of their skin. If black people are doing things like telling you facts, disagreeing with you, protesting, talking about the police, or telling white people they should maybe be quiet and listen, then you can honor black history by telling them that Martin Luther King stood against violence and that they should be more like him. Sure, I don't think anybody's going to be offended by that. You know, despite the goods or bads, he was a remarkable person. But I think I read that wrong. I thought they were saying that white people should be more like Martin Luther King, but I think that they're saying that if black people are doing things like telling you facts or disagreeing with you, then you can honor black history by telling them that Martin Luther King stood against violence and they should be more like him. So that's something you're not supposed to do. You're supposed to embrace the violence, I guess. Remember, actual violence against black people, like police shootings or deaths in immigration custody, isn't really violence because they deserve it. But black people talking about racism is definitely violent, and MLK would be ashamed of them. The thing is, BLM wasn't talking, they were blocking off highways and beating people up, and police shootings aren't responsible for a disproportionate amount of black people compared to all sorts of other causes. My last video made it clear that there are direct, actionable steps that you could take to save way more black lives, younger black lives, than the hoodlums shot by cops. By and large, I mean, there are exceptions where an innocent guy shot for a stupid ass reason. It happens maybe 5 times a year, and it's awful. So for this brief section, I am going to show some statistics. How you interpret these statistics are going to depend on how you count the police officers. Now, before you conclude the way that you want to interpret the numbers, consider that a number of the people killed by police are killed by during police custody or during escort, in court, attending a trial, by bailiffs, by college officers and stuff like that who are included in this extended count. So if you want to do the least inclusive count, what you can do is take all of the numbers I'm going to present and you half them, but it still proves my point. So American police kill 1,000 people a year. If there are 1 million police officers in the U.S., extended, definition of the police officers to include bailiffs and college officers and all sorts of other officers of the law, right? They have a lower murder rate than several Mexican and Brazilian and Venezuelan cities. If every single police-related death were a murder. In some years, East St. Louis has also beat out this number. Currently, if 65% of police-related deaths were murders, they'd have a murder rate comparable to East St. Louis. If half of all police-related deaths were murders, they'd be comparable to Baltimore. And looking at entire states, if 10% of police-related deaths were murders, over 100 deaths a year, they'd be comparable to the states of Louisiana, Missouri, Nevada, and Maryland. And if police commit 50 murders or wrongful deaths, or however you want to say it, a year, that'd be a rate comparable to the average American population. And when you really start to dissect this shit, it's fucking ridiculous. Okay, back to this bullshit line of just, is it called gish galloping? These gish galloping bullshit arguments, like, they deserve it. Like, it's as if she's suggesting that black people, or that white people think that black people deserve to be shot just for the color of their skin, and not because they've got a gun and they're waving it at a cop, or they're in a high-speed chase running into people, or, whatever the situation is that happens. Again, like I showed in my last video, there are simple, practical solutions that could save more black lives than you're going to save by attacking the police. It's really not about black lives, though. This is about their revolution. It's also really important in Black History Month to remind black people that they are the real racists. Black people talking about racism is what creates racism, which is why slavery was created by black people. That's actually true. Well, no, I'm sure there are levels on which that's true. I mean, if everybody came out of Africa and was all black people, well, then slavery was certainly ongoing back then. But there was also slavery in Africa by Africans, by Europeans, by Middle Easterners especially. The difference is the Muslim practice of castration left no ancestors to complain about their mistreatment. You may remember that Sargon of Akkad recently had a debate with a feminist, and they had a major point of contention which she ended up leaving the conversation because of, over whether the first American to own slaves was a black man, and whether black people were complicit in their own slavery. And what Sargon was talking about is Anthony Johnson here. He was a black Angolan. He got freedom in early 17th century Virginia. He was given property after his indentured servitude was over in 1621. He became a property-owning tobacco farmer and was one of the first people to have his right to own slaves legally recognized. So Whether he was the first or not, who knows, but yeah, he played a role in legalizing slavery in America. Johnson himself was captured in Angola by an enemy nation, probably some African nation which doesn't exist anymore, uh, and sold to Arab slave traders. Johnson almost lost his life in the Indian Massacre of 1622 when his master's plantation was attacked, where they killed 52 of the 57 men. And this is kind of a hidden history. I mean, as far as I know, literally hundreds of villages were exterminated, like to the man, woman, and child in the colonial era by native raiding groups. And actually, it's interesting if you look into it, they were also genociding each other during this era too. They would move in and massacre another native group. Real racism is defined as slavery, burning crosses, or actively wearing a KKK hood to class. However, should you need to defend any of those things, then they are also issues that are debatable. For example, if someone spray paints the N-word on a black person's home, remind them that rappers say the N-word too. If someone burns a cross on a black person's lawn, point out that BLM support killing the police. Don't worry about actually reading BLM's platform or anything.
Because you could be a pastor and you could pick up a gun and shoot a cop. You could be a social justice worker and you could pick up a rock and smash a military man in the head.
If black people talk about slavery, say that black people sold slaves too. The important thing here is that whatever white people do, it's actually black people's fault. Black people have all the power in society after all. Which is really just the inverse of her own argument, which is bullshit to start with. Because in her world, the plight of black people is all white people's fault. Whether they're in America or Africa or South America for that matter. When black people talk about any of the racism they experience daily, make sure to tell them that talking about these issues takes away from the issues of real racism. Yeah, like racial-based assault.
Hey, white, get their ass! Come on, nigga! Burn that bitch up! Hey! Hey, they clean up! Hey, they beating up every white person! They jumping every white person! Man, no white person come down Sherman! He white! Beat his shit! Bitch! That's what it's for! Hey, look! White boy! They beating up every white person! They beat up every... They made the squad cars leave. They not. They beat somebody's ass. Look, they beat somebody's ass, y'all. Look. Look. Look, bro, look. Ooh, look, y'all, look. Oh, my God, look. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. Oh, my God, look. Who they just beat up, bro? Now, see, this ain't on the play, but I think they just beat some white bitch ass for no reason. They bust her window and everything.
I mean, white people haven't pulled shit like that since desegregation. And leave it to Snopes to report on this story and tell you that nobody got attacked. According to police reports, an 18-year-old boy was shot in the neck leaving some sort of a house, white guy. A 16-year-old girl, I believe it was shot in the abdomen. I believe she was a black girl. And police vehicles took numerous rounds. Eight rounds to the armored vehicle. I think it was the one that they brought in to save the white kid, but I'm not quite sure on that. because the paramedics were getting attacked by the protesters. It took like 2 hours to get to the guy. But yeah, they had to bring in an armored car to save him. And then a shitload of buildings were burned right to the ground. Part of a conversation. We're having a dialogue here. Another thing that I showed in my last video is that, according to the FBI hate crime stats, black Americans are almost twice as likely to commit a hate crime as white Americans. And that's despite likely underreporting on black on white hate crimes. Not that I have data to back up that latter claim, but I do speculate. No matter what issue black people are identifying, workplace racism, racial profiling, black people dying, remind them that real racism existed in the past and what they are experiencing today doesn't count. Don't forget to inform black people that talking about their actual lives cheapens a real racism that never actually happens, and that they are to blame when it does happen, which it never does, because they made people not care about the real racism by talking about things that aren't really racist. I know it's confusing. It's real simple if you take a step back for a fucking minute and actually look at it without your fucking melanin-tinted glasses. Black History Month is also a good time to learn the name of one black person to prove that you aren't racist. This year, it's a good idea to just say Viola Desmond's name randomly. Try to use it to remind black people today how they should just be quiet, because Viola Desmond stood up and fought real racism. You don't have to know any other black women from history, or respect or listen to any living black women. Just say, I'm not a racist, I admire Viola Desmond. Talk about what a pretty, nearly white-looking lady she was, while stroking her face on the bill. If only all black women looked like that gal, they wouldn't all be single mothers. What a fucking racist bitch, man. You can't be racist if you find her attractive. This is a fucking progressive bullshit that just really gets me. And don't worry, we're gonna talk about Viola Desmond. I put together an interesting little bit on her. If black people actually protest, make sure that you emphasize how few of them there are. They don't speak for all black people. But also, even though there's only a few of them, black people protesting are also the greatest threat to society. And so it's also really important to wring your hands about how they are the problem. This is a good time to talk about your black friend who agrees with you, and also thinks that those black people should just be grateful. Your black friend, like that cab driver who drove you to the airport once, and just nodded silently the whole drive. Gosh, if only they were all like that, we wouldn't be in the same pickle. Instead of the cab drivers who refuse to transport me because I'm carrying liquor, because I had lots of those in Edmonton. Or the ones who drive the pet taxi but won't carry dogs when they show up at your house. Hell, my one friend, he brought back wine from his vacation, was it to Europe? And he had his suitcase loaded into the back at the airport, and found out he had wine, and they made him unload his suitcases. And the idea of a cabbie that won't carry liquor, that's just fucking stupid. If you find yourself in a discussion about racism during Black History Month, blame the problems in the black community on the fact that black people just don't respect education. I don't even think I need to insert footage of an American classroom right now, do I? If they put more time into learning and less time into listening to hip-hop, that hippity-hop, you know, maybe we wouldn't have so much crime. All them white kids, them good white kids, none of them listen to that hippity-hop. Fuck. But also, if an educated black person knows more than you, and is talking about educated in sociology, is that? Educated in Afro studies? Is that it? If a educated black person knows more than you and is talking about issues of race with authority and facts, then you call them elitist and suggest that they're uppity. Or just ignore what they are saying and that they just hate white people.
Thank you for sharing this.
Things that qualify as hating white people include identifying and accurately talking about the history of white supremacy, raising statistics about street checks, or accurately posting white people's own words. What are the statistics about street checks? Is it that black kids carry drugs more often? If you hate black people, though, then remember, you are just debating, or a straight shooter saying the thing everyone thinks. Really, the person who's most like MLK here is you. So just debating, raising statistics for good points that aren't in the educated black history curriculum book, right? Whatever the fuck. If you're raising points that aren't sympathetic with the Black Lives Matter movement or really try to address any greater issue at all, you're the racist, right? But the crazy shit is we're talking about Halifax. We're not talking about America.
Now, it's important that you understand the plight that people of color face at the hands of the police in Halifax, Nova Scotia, here in Canada. So here we've got a list of killings by law enforcement officers in Canada. And it goes all the way back to, the 1930s at least. So let's Control F here and find Halifax. We got one entry from 1980. Albert Hollett died after an altercation with two police officers on a bridge between Halifax and Dartmouth. Both officers were charged with second-degree murder. One was acquitted, and the other was convicted of manslaughter. That's probably an interesting case. But 1980, we're going back a ways there. Let's look at Nova Scotia. We have 3 entries for Nova Scotia. 2006, Robert Gregory was shot by RCMP. The shooting was justified by authorities. Nova Scotia, unknown, struck and killed by police vehicle. And the third case was also the first case we looked at.
It takes real courage to stand up and talk about how black people should just pull up their pants if they don't want to get shot by police. Also learn the words border security, Canadian values, and thugs to have conversations about hating black people while claiming you are just discussing respecting the law. Now, I don't actually know what she's talking about with somebody dying at the border. I'll look into that, I guess. So what they're talking about, the immigrant who died in police custody, was a Nigerian guy who was being deported, and he attacked the officers and forced the plane to make an emergency landing. And he was in medical distress, I'm guessing from the strain of fighting 2 officers. Probably had a heart attack or some shit. The police had injuries, minor injuries. They're taken to the hospital. He had made comments saying he wouldn't allow himself to be removed from Canada. Guy's been here 13 years making all sorts of freaking claims. So yeah, that's pretty much par for the course, right? So I don't want to make it a whole big thing here, but Canada's got thousands of people just streaming over the border from the US making refugee claims in Canada. And so Trudeau's got our police out there setting up camps and helping them haul their luggage and bring them down to get freaking registered. And I've covered it in some of my other videos, so if you haven't seen it, you'll have to look through my catalog and find it, I guess. I'm sure it has a Canadian flag or something. Black History Month can be a good time to attend black events. Make sure to take a picture so you can use it as proof later that you have black friends and are not racist. Because that's really important in this super racist society. You want to show all your white friends that I guess you own all those black people around you. Look at my my plantation here. Is that what you're going for? Be careful though. You don't want to go to events in the black community. That's dangerous. Stick to events in safe places like libraries, not in black communities. If you do go, feel free to approach any speakers who speak about things like police profiling, racism in the school system, or their daily experiences of white supremacy, and inform them that they just lost an ally because of their tone. Remind them that if they want people to listen to them, they should probably stop being so angry. This is a good time to bring up MLK. Other good topics to raise with speakers at these events are, why don't you talk about black on black crime? And watch her not even address this. Is anyone talking about how they don't have fathers in the home? Or that? I'd like to hear someone talk about how affirmative action actually harms black people by making them think they're as good as white people when they aren't. Oh, that's a cell phone. And maybe you should talk about personal responsibility. I think that's a reference to Jordan Peterson there. And actually, I suppose it's even more likely that they're talking about Thomas Sowell, a man whose black card was taken away a long time ago. But that's not addressed, though. I mean, why don't they address those? Alternatively, if you don't want to attend any events, then point out how it's not fair that Nazis aren't allowed to meet, but black people can hold events where they drum and dance. Why is there no White History Month you can use as you attend Maxime Bernier's convention? So I'm going to play a clip here, and we'll get to see exactly what sort of a white supremacist Klan rally these Maxime Bernier conventions are.
It's time to vote for what you believe in. Those values that make Canadians strong and free. Les choses qui nous sont les plus chères dans la vie sont celles qui méritent qu'on se batte pour elles. I went into politics for the ideas. Free markets, less government, respect for our Constitution. That encourage the private sector to invest and create wealth. Qui donne à tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes la chance de réaliser leurs rêves.
Je m'appelle Alessa et je vote Maxime Bernier. C'est le candidat du moment. Je crois en ses valeurs de famille, ses idées pour le libre marché. Go Maxime! Votez Maxime Bernier.
I support Maxime Bernier because he's demonstrated leadership characteristics that show his high regard for freedom, fairness, and inclusion. He has a clear strategy for a growing economy, and I think he can better balance our budget.
Il est temps de voter en accord avec vos convictions.
Why don't white people get to be proud of who they are, you wonder, wearing your MAGA hat? Black History Month can be a challenging time, what with it being that one time a year your workplace, school, or local news actually forces you to see a black face or listen to something about black people. We shouldn't be forcing people to watch fucking anything. Is this Clockwork Orange? Your school or workplace? Which other anything is your school and workplace and local news all coordinating to educate you on? I mean, come on. Everything is about black people these days. However, with a bit of planning, you can make this month work for you as a white person. If nothing else, you can always remind black people we give you Black History Month. What else do you want? Next time they demand things like stopping deportations of workers, not being followed around stores and accused of shoplifting, or for white people to not touch their hair. I'd kind of like to do a hidden camera experiment where I walk around a Shoppers Drug Mart or something and Watch all the female clerks following me around with their suspicious corner freaking gazing. I mean, come on, racial profiling. People steal shit. I think I fucking covered this already, so why am I going over it again? I wonder if I asked Sticks or Razorfist if someone ever asked if they could touch their hair or just touch their hair without asking. I mean, you think?
So we were the first Westerners to go there in over 60 years. So the village we flew into, they'd literally never seen white people before. And then we went 200 kilometers from that. So like middle of nowhere.
Did they want to touch you?
Yeah, hair. Because their hair was very dark and very different. And like, I'm not particularly fair, but just to touch like the hair and see the blue eyes and stuff, they were just loving
friendly?
it. Super friendly.
So the author, L. Jones, you won't be surprised by this, holds the Nancy's chair. Well, you might be surprised by that because you don't know what the fuck it is, and me neither. In Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. Yeah, Women's Studies professor. Get educated. So the article said you gotta learn one black name for Black History Month, and that should be Viola Desmond. So that's what we're gonna do. And if you don't already know, Viola Desmond is being put on the Canadian $10 bill, where she's replacing John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister. And so we're going to see why. So as a kid, she immigrated to the USA, took beauty school training, returned to Canada, and opened up a business. Started training other black women to be, I guess, beauticians at salons. So on a trip through town, her car broke down and she decided to go see a movie and pass the time while it was being fixed. The Dark Mirror. There were no laws enforcing segregation, and the theater had no signs saying there was a segregated seating. But apparently the main floor seats were actually reserved for white patrons. Now, this rather central claim of racial discrimination goes more or less completely unexamined in any of the contemporary media. I'll show you where one of the sources I use seems to suggest that the seats weren't always segregated, just some or most of the time, but not all of the time. And comments made in the trial show that actual discrimination is illegal at this point. But the way I see it, there are a couple different ways this story could have played out. 3 main ways, I think. Number 1, Viola Desmond walked in, she bought a cheaper ticket and took a more expensive seat and was asked to move and then cried victimhood. 2, the management of the establishment had a policy of segregated seating and were racist and threw Viola Desmond out because she was a black woman. And then they came up with a way to call the cops on her, and the cops all agreed because they're racist cops, and the court fined her, and the court agreed because they're a racist court. Or 3, and this is a pretty likely scenario too, is that Viola Davis bought a less expensive seat, took a more expensive seat, and then was removed by an employee who made a racial comment. I also have a sneaking suspicion that the ACLU has a little to do with the current framing of the story as well. But even if it's all 100% true, ask yourself if that's the sort of thing that lands a person on the back of a banknote. Miss Desmond was sold a balcony seat, unaware of the segregation, and being nearsighted. So pay attention to this, because this is important. We're going to go over a few different versions of this case. It changes a lot. Unaware of the segregation and being nearsighted, went to sit in the floor section to be close to the screen. When she was asked to move, she realized what was happening and refused to move because she had a better view from the main floor. Then she was forcibly removed from the theater, causing injury to her hip, and was arrested for 12 hours in jail and paid a $20 fine. The tax on the balcony price of 20 cents was 2 cents, and the tax on the floor price of 40 cents was 3 cents. She was convicted of depriving the government of 1 cent in tax. Desmond was kept in jail overnight and was never informed about her right to legal advice, a lawyer, or bail. Now, that last part I don't agree with, but I'm pretty sure they can still do that. I was threatened with being held with no charges for carrying liquor legally, with ID, in a bag, sealed, sober. No fucking reason at all other than the cop on a power trip. But hey, at least I wasn't racially profiled, right? Besides, I don't think you get a bail hearing when you're only being held for 12 hours, otherwise every drunk in the drunk tank would be making a civil rights complaint. Now, I'm also not sure what the law says here as far as legal advice goes, because this appears to be a fine, not a criminal offense per se. And that's part of the problem I have with this story is so much of it seems to be post hoc reasoning from their own legal team. And in fact, I didn't see any quotes or any of the legal claims made by either the theater or the Crown prosecutors. And so, I can appreciate fighting for your civil rights and standing up to authority, but what happened here was it cost twice as much for a floor seat as a balcony seat, and they went to the more expensive seat. And I mean, as far as the tax goes, that's been imposed on the theater by the government. If they aren't collecting their taxes, then they're going to be the ones who are liable. And obviously, they chose to prosecute a 1 cent tax case. And so leaders from her church encouraged her to take action and fight the charge in court. The Clarion, the first black-owned and published Nova Scotia newspaper, helped publicize the story. And the Nova Scotia Association for the Advancement of Colour People, the NSAACP, hired a lawyer for her. The laws themselves that she was prosecuted under weren't racist, and I'm sure you can find some white people being prosecuted under some stupid fucking laws too. How long ago was it that we stopped criminalizing gays? Much after this, actually. Quite a while after this. Well, that's an extreme example. I'm sure you can find just as petty excuses as a 1 cent tax. And so on the appeal, they appealed on the grounds of wrongful accusal of tax evasion, and not on the basis of racial discrimination. So when discussing the case, the judge said, had the matter reached the court by some other method than certiorari, there might have been an opportunity to right the wrong done this unfortunate woman. One wonders if the manager of the theater who laid the complaint was so zealous because of a bona fide belief that there had been an attempt to defraud the province of Nova Scotia of the sum of 1 cent, or whether it was a surreptitious endeavor to enforce a Jim Crow rule by misuse of a public statute. I guess that's basically the judge saying, I'm not racist, but... So even back then, 1946, racism wasn't legal. It wasn't a recognized position in the courts. And the money won from the case helped fund and establish the NAACP in Nova Scotia. So now let's look at the same account from the Canadian Encyclopedia. At the Roseland Theatre, Desmond requested a ticket for a seat on the main floor. The ticket seller handed Desmond a ticket to the balcony instead, the seating generally reserved for non-white customers. So I'd like to know what generally means. Generally seems to imply not always. Also, you may have noticed I've been calling her Viola Davis off and on. I'm thinking of Angela Davis, the prison abolitionist. I don't feel like going back and redubbing it, so I'm making you aware of my mistake here. Walking into the main floor seating area, she was challenged by the ticket taker, who told her that the ticket was for an upstairs seat, where she would have to move. Thinking that a mistake had been made, Desmond returned to the cashier and asked her to exchange the ticket for one downstairs. The cashier refused, saying, I'm sorry, but I'm not permitted to sell downstairs tickets to you people. Realizing that the cashier was referring to the color of her skin, Desmond decided to take a seat on the main floor anyway. Desmond was then confronted by the manager, who argued that the theater had a right to refuse admission to any objectionable person. Desmond argued that she hadn't been refused admission when sold the ticket and that she attempted to exchange it and was willing to pay the difference. When she declined to leave her seat, a police officer was called. Desmond was dragged out of the theater, injuring her hip and knee, and taken to jail. And in a third recounting by the Globe and Mail, Miss Desmond was short-sighted and needed a better view, and tried to buy a floor seat, but was refused because she was black. Whereas in the last story we read, she bought the other seat and then tried to exchange it and was refused. This time those two events are happening in the opposite order. So then she bought a balcony seat, which was 1 cent cheaper, but sat in the floor area until theater staff called the police and had her dragged out. She spent 12 hours in jail. Well, no, the seats weren't 1 cent cheaper. They were 20 cents cheap. They were 21 cents cheaper. I mean, that's some fucking fact checking by the Globe and Mail editorial team. Once again, they could have read the goddamn Wikipedia article and not made themselves look like fools. And in this case, kind of like Thunderfoot with his 800,000 people watching that video where he's completely wrong. I mean, this is the kind of information that gets put into our heritage and our history books. I mean, the Globe and Mail article is going to get cited on the Wikipedia article, and next thing you know, it's in the history books, and there we are. Suddenly we've gone from a situation where a woman took a half-price seat in the theater where she's riding first class instead of passenger and gets thrown off the plane kind of deal, to instead it's some petty, the government saw a black woman in a fucking theater and arrested her over 1 cent. It's a complete distortion of the chain of events.
And if you have any kids or know any kids in the Canadian school system, I would not be surprised if they were taught this story this year. In fact, I assume that it is or will soon become part of the curriculum, considering that Viola Desmond is on the $10 bill put on it this year. And I'd be curious to know how many of them are being taught the 1 cent version of the story, and how many of them are being taught the 20 or 21 cent version. And so, I mean, this is a perfectly reasonable conversation. If you know any kids, bring out a $10 bill and ask them about the story, which version that they've learned, if they've learned it. I suppose in the meantime I can do my part and see if I can find any actual curriculum. And if you don't think that's the type of conversation you should be having with kids, while the government and their teachers feel otherwise, and they're taking the matters into their own hands. And exactly as expected, here's the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario Black Canadian Curriculum Junior Teacher Resource, with 16 references to Viola Desmond.
And so now this is quoting Viola Desmond's sister. She said, this is a quote, she said, "I stretched out and I was just getting comfortable, and I thought, oh, this is nice, and I won't worry about anything," her sister Wanda Robson recalled at the 2016 ceremony where the Desmond banknote was announced. And then this usher came up and told her she couldn't sit there. So again, we have a completely different chain of events from the Wikipedia article to the Canadian Encyclopedia to the Globe and Mail article, which quotes her own sister. How does that happen? And like I say, I appreciate someone standing up for themselves and civil rights activists and stuff like that, but I mean, is this the kind of noteworthy event that merits replacing the first prime minister on the Canadian $10 bill? Like, even among civil rights figures, this seems like an unremarkable reason to replace what is essentially Canada's founding father, and a nation that's fought 2 world wars in which 100,000 Canadian men died. I mean, 4 years prior to this, in 1942, the Canadian Armed Forces began commissioning black officers. You know, all of whom I'm sure would have a far more inspiring story than this. I mean, I can see why they need to alter and lionize the story. There's not much to work with. I mean, the original version, it kind of sounds like a Mr. Magoo skit.
Now, where is that Rialto Theater? Around here someplace. Ah, there it is. Wonder what's playing tonight. 3D. Oh, by George, I'm in luck. 1, please. Oh, thank you. Orchestra, please.
Yes, sir. Go right in, sir.
Oh, thank you.
Well,
I'm a cop. A cop? That's a good plot.
a cop?
Yes, ma'am.
What do you want?
A man.
Me too.
Yes, ma'am. Probably on the trail of some bank teller with a briefcase full of stolen Liberty bonds.
Is he wearing a black hat?
Yes, ma'am.
Glasses?
Yes, ma'am.
Briefcase?
Yes, ma'am. Seen him?
No, ma'am.
Thanks, ma'am.
I'll find him, because I'm a cop.
Oh, this realism. I feel he might reach out and grab me. Oh, it must be anything. And away we go.